IGF is the one moment in my annual calendar.
So the importance of IGF, it's actually about the quality of conversations.
I think it's such a fascinating mixture of people, businesses, the public sector.
You need places like the India Global Forum for the rest of the world to be interacting with.
We are all united in our desire for the same things. We want our businesses to grow, our careers to flourish, and our communities to thrive. We want to meet people who energize us, share exciting ideas, and discover new opportunities.
From India to the UK to the UAE and beyond, IGF is committed to bringing the contemporary India story.
Under the leadership of Manoj Ladwell, the forum is doing a great job of bringing together global climate leaders.
That we see the Indian community for the success story you are in 21st century Britain.
फ्यूचर बहुत ब्राइट है, हम बहुत तेजी से और एक बड़े स्केल के साथ आगे बढ़ते जा रहे हैं.
Amongst ongoing global turbulence, IGF remains at the center of limitless innovation, limitless possibilities, and limitless collaboration, harnessing talent, technology, and enterprise across sectors and geographies for maximum impact. India Global Forum is the gateway for global stakeholders to invest in and benefit from India's global trajectory. Hear from industry titans, build strategic partnerships, invest in the future. Only at India Global Forum. Join the conversation at www.indiaglobalforum.com.
Welcome to day 2 at the IGF 2024, and this is our Climate and Business Forum, ClimB, in association with Bloomberg. Big thank you to our supporting partner, Bharat Forge, and session partner, Hero Future Energies. So why are we gathered here today? Well, of course, to focus on how we can drive the energy transition, green finance and green technologies, how we can drive them forward so that we have the faintest chance of meeting our net zero targets. Because friends, let's accept it, it's still pretty well out of reach right now. How do we bring the future we want closer to us? We're going to be hearing from global leaders in business, finance, technology, policy development too, some thought leaders. We'll showcase innovative solutions from not just India, but from around the world. And what are we going to be talking about? Well, what the goals should be. Do they need to be adjusted? How we're going to meet them? How we're going to finance them? Are we going to run out of power in this all-electric world? And much more. Enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to my good friend Vikram Chandra, who is here to lead a conversation on driving the SDG agenda forwards. Vikram.
Right, thank you both so much for being with us. Sanjeev, I'm going to start off with you because the basic point that I was just trying to make, how do you keep the focus when you're looking at economic policy, when you're looking at the priorities of a nation, when you're talking about the need to build roads and highways and infrastructure and airports and power, and also have to worry now in India, especially after these elections, on the questions around things like unemployment and jobs and social welfare. How do you ensure that sustainability isn't lost sight of?
Thanks, Vikram. Let me say that obviously, as I spoke yesterday as well at the same forum, that growth is our single biggest focus, along with macro stability and the need to target the bottom of the pyramid, the bottom 20%, directly with transfers of various kinds. This is the growth model. Now, obviously, SDGs is something we have signed up for. It fits. I don't think there's much of a contradiction in really, because obviously many of the SDGs are about poverty removal, development, and so on. But I think when you say sustainability, one of the things that you're talking really is about the energy transition. That is what most people these days mean when they say sustainability. And let me say, in the specific case of India, there's no real contradiction in this. For the simplest reason, India is a hydrocarbons poor country. The gods did not bless us with large amounts of gas and oil, a little bit of coal, but not much. But we are blessed with lots of sunshine, source of all the heat you were talking about. And also true that the spike in energy needs is for cooling. So we get that sunshine at exactly the same time as we need the energy. So our real problem is being able to use this huge amount of solar radiation to convert it efficiently into usable energy. Secondly, find ways of storing it. This is absolutely critical because obviously, as everybody knows, there are spikes, that you have to use it at night, and so on and so forth. And so we are investing in various kinds of technologies. One of the ones that I'll talk about is hydrogen. Very often this conversation about hydrogen gets talked about mobile hydrogen and cars. But in fact, the real big need is static hydrogen. And almost every big company in India is now investing massively in static hydrogen, as you may be aware. And it's still an experiment. We are not 100% sure how this is all going to, where exactly it will lead and whether it will actually be a success. But let me say that we have not held back. The government, virtually every large corporation has now invested in green hydrogen. In many parts of the country, huge vats of these hydrogen things are being created so that we can burn it at night. So basically, idea is use solar energy, split water, convert it into hydrogen and oxygen, burn it at night or whenever you need it in order to convert it back to energy. And that is something that, is completely in alignment both with our economic needs and the sustainability goals as well.
I'm going to come to get more of the details of that from you because I quite often have people saying, what exactly is this green hydrogen and is it really going to be transformative? Solar everyone gets, obviously, but is that something that's really going to be game-changing? I'm going to come to you in a little bit more detail on that. But Kate, if I could get you into that on the broader question, not just in India, but in all the various countries where you advise and you talk to people, is it a zero-sum game or, as Sanjeev said, it's not because you should be doing poverty alleviation in any case that covers a lot of the SDGs. And when it comes to when it comes to energy transition, that again is something which may well be good economics in it. So it is something that you should have as a focus. But do people see it as a zero-sum game, even now?
I think that point of view is somewhat marginal now, honestly, particularly when it comes to the energy transition, because we've obviously seen through massive deployment the costs coming down. That doesn't mean that it's yet affordable for many, because the issue with clean energy is that the capex, the upfront cost is high, but the operating cost is low. So for many countries, the cost of capital is what drives the affordability. And it's very difficult for many countries at the moment to access at a reasonable level of interest rates the capital that they need to deploy it. And often the most affected vulnerable communities, so not just countries, also have difficulties accessing capital for reasons of financial inclusion. So the affordability depends very much on the cost of capital now rather than the long-term cost, because it's now much, much cheaper to use clean energy. There are many synergies, potentially. I mean, even looking, for example, at the results of the Africa Climate Summit that we worked very closely with the government of Kenya on, shifting the narrative in Africa, where many of the critical minerals come from, to one of opportunity as opposed to just vulnerability. So countries that are producing critical minerals, can they use that as a way to increase value addition by having some of the processing done locally and use renewable energy to power that? And then obviously, because you've got industrial off-takers, that would then support the grid infrastructure, which would then enable potentially support for communities achieving electrification. So a grand vision was set out at the Africa Climate Summit of how to bring development, value addition, jobs, access to energy together as part of the green transition. But of course, it's absolutely crucial that the resources are available to do that at affordable cost. And at the moment, we're seeing net outflows from many developing countries due to the debt crisis. That is something that needs to be addressed with urgency. We need a global financial architecture that delivers net inflows, because that's where the investment is needed. And so there's a lot to be done in terms of making our financial system work for the energy transition in places where affordability is a real issue.
Right. Sanjeev, when it comes to India specifically, it's not so much the lack of access to capital now that is a gating issue. As India is becoming a $4 trillion economy, there's more than enough money, and this government in particular has shown the ability and the willingness to really put the money down when it comes to building roads, for example, or other infrastructure, revamping the entire defense infrastructure. Talk us in a little bit more detail on what you started referring to, the entire, how the sustainability part of it can be done, because big capital will be required to set up a hydrogen infrastructure. It's not just electric vehicles, although that's part of it. Emissions also ties in with something else that is a major crisis in India, which is air pollution across northern India. What's the big picture that has been put into place right now in India?
So, I mean, I could talk for hours on this issue.
Yeah, I know.
But the issue here is this. Capital, yes, the cost of capital is still somewhat of an issue. It's not gone away. But yes, compared to
the availability of capital.
Availability is there and scale is there. Even the cost of capital is eventually dribbling down. I mean, our macroeconomic stability is much, much better than it used to be. I think we can reasonably expect a series of sovereign upgrades over the next few years. And I think the cost of capital will generally come down to something much more closer to developed country levels over the next, not too distant future. But I think there are a few things we need to have. First of all, we need to be clear that during this transition, we are not ideological about it, in the sense that we do need to maintain a mix of various sources of energy, which must include nuclear, in my view. We should also not get too worked up about, we will still continue to build a few hydrocarbons with coal-fired or gas-fired thermal plants, because they are needed for the spikes and for unusual weather conditions where we may need it. And while the mix will change, we do not want to be in a position like, for example, Germany found itself, when there are variations of various kinds for whatever reason, weather or otherwise, where you do not have at least some amount of traditional backups. Now, meanwhile, of course, technology may keep improving. And so, and in the long run, we are very clear we want to move on to, solar and other sources of energy as well. So this is where it is. But I want to bring a little bit of attention to some other areas of sustainability. I think having focused so much on just the energy transition, we have, unfortunately, began to take our eyes off many other forms of sustainability that is important. First of all, I think, for example, the excessive use of plastics and the fact that it's now entering into our food chains everywhere is a huge threat. Because the sustainability space is almost all eaten up by this energy transition conversation, we are not paying attention to many of these other things. Similarly, whether we like it or not, we have probably gone past some tipping point of changes in climate. I don't want to get into the debate on whether man-made or natural or whatever. Point is, there is enough instability in weather systems. And I think we need to invest in adaptability and at least pay attention to it, which we don't adequately pay attention to, especially for food. And here in India, we are doing a lot of work, particularly trying to encourage the revival of various kinds of millets and so on. Because our traditional grains are very often much more resilient to temperature variations. With our population stabilizing, growing ever more genetically modified foods is not necessarily the way we want to go. So, protecting our traditional agriculture, which is much more resilient and very often much more nutritious, also needs to be a part of this. I'm just giving you a few more examples of things we need to think about rather than get obsessed with purely this energy transition thing.
Right. Kate, I think that's a great point which I want to throw to you, because not only do you, for example, work with things like the International Solar Alliance, which ties in with energy transition, but you also work in areas like children's nutrition or disaster resilience or digital health now as well.
Yes, that's right. I very much agree with Sanjeev, actually, particularly in terms of the issue around resilience. We have locked in a level of climate disruption now, which does require action. India, for example, is a leader in regenerative agriculture, what Indians call traditional agriculture. Actually, many countries around the world are now looking at the Indian model of regenerative agriculture because it helps with both resilience and mitigation and livelihoods. So we're looking, for example, at Indian examples in applying them in places like Kenya because a lot of smallholder farmers are finding with increasing drought and the increase of in cost in inputs, they need another way of farming to feed their families. And biodiversity, the traditional crops, all of those things are what we need to take on board. So very much agree with that. We find there's a massive coincidence between the effects on children in terms of their health and education when there are extreme climate events. So one of the things that we're looking at is essentially providing more nutritious school meals to keep kids in school, because one of the first things that the poorest communities will do to adapt to climate change is they will pull their child, usually their girl child, out of school in order to support the family, or because they can't afford the school meals or the school uniforms or whatever. So in many places where we're working now, we're supporting the increase of school meal provision using locally sourced foods, and we've got a program that we're scaling up in partnership with a number of African countries now. So we do see how health, nutrition, education, climate change, all of these things are becoming closely interrelated, and sharing best practices, supporting South-South collaboration around those issues is where the solutions are to be found. I'm not seeing the solutions come from developed countries. I'm seeing most of the solutions actually come from emerging economies and developing economies, because there's much more commonality in terms of the climatic conditions that they're facing in the tropical zone, but also in terms of the rollout of infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure is newer. It's not so much a question of retrofit, it's a question of thinking about resilience in new build. So, for example, the Indian initiative on disaster resilient infrastructure is providing a place for a lot of particularly South-South collaboration around making infrastructure more resilient.
Right. As we approach the end of this session, Sanjeev, just wanted to ask you, the eyes of the world actually on what's going to be happening in the 100-day program that this government is bringing out. A lot of the issues that we are talking about are also, interlinked, and the sort of reforms and the changes that India might bring about could have an impact elsewhere. Take, for example, the farm laws that were attempted earlier. If the farm laws, some of the changes that happened out there, it would have had an impact not just on the food grain habits that you're talking about, what is being cultivated. It has its impact on groundwater extraction, because water is going to be the other big crisis as we move forward. So what are some of the areas that you think we can expect big change and big reform?
Well, it's not for me to speak for the government till they have formally announced what they want to
I
do.
was trying my luck.
But let me say that, at least in this space, a lot of what we need to do is not, much of it is just common sense, and we've been talking about it for a very long time. Even the farm laws, you will find it difficult to find economists who would argue against doing them. It's a different,
or labor laws for that matter.
So the point is, for a variety of reasons, those farm laws did not stick politically, which I can't comment on. But point of the matter is, there was good economic reasons for doing it, and some of the states have actually moved on and done something in those lines, and quite successfully as well. So, reforms require sometimes the step back as well. But in the end, what needs to be done is well understood in many, many cases. I think it's trickier when you're coming into these new areas. I specifically mentioned plastics, because that is an area actually in which not much thought even has gone into about what to do. I mean, we know what to do. Whether we'll do a good job or not, I'll leave it to others. But we know what to do on energy transition. Whether we find the finances and all that, But in the case of plastics, we are, the world has not really thought this through at all.
Right. That's a really interesting point. What are we going to do on plastics? What are we going to do in areas like water? Kate, any final thoughts from you before we end the session?
Yes, I mean, plastics is clearly a really important issue that I'm not an expert on, but when it comes to other kinds of resource use, I think the front line in cities is going to be water. We're already seeing around the world many communities dealing with intermittency of water supply, which is causing unrest in many locations around the world, and there are many cities that, in our lifetimes, we're going to see really serious water shortages. And so that comes to the point of, are our cities ready for this challenge, and do we have the public investment necessary? For much of the energy transition, there's a revenue stream. People are buying services that should be easy to finance. It's about the enabling environment. But for a lot of the other investments, whether you're talking about investments on resilience, there's not often an obvious revenue stream. So it's going to require a lot of careful thought and policy work to deliver, so that the people living with corrugated metal roofs are not dying of heat in their own homes. We really need to address these really, really serious issues for the most vulnerable, and that's going to require a scale-up of public investment alongside private investment where there are revenue streams.
Right, Kate, Sanjeev, thank you both so much for being with us. I'm going to toss it across to my friend Ben to take it forward from here. Ben.
Thank you very much. Vikram, thank you so much. And what a great way for us to start today's discussions. So much that we covered there we will look at in detail over the course of the day, particularly things like financing that we'll talk about in our next panel, but also green hydrogen that we'll cover a little later too. And so they're really clear that we've established what needs to be done. Next, we will examine how that might be done. Crucially, of course, how it will be paid for. Nearly $6 trillion will be needed by 2030 to help developing countries meet their climate targets. There is a huge challenge ahead right now. So how can international financing help meet some of those needs and drive sustainable innovation? To look at that question, I'm delighted to introduce our next panel. With us, Julia Hoggett, who's the Chief Executive of the London Stock Exchange Group, Neha Manaktala, who is Head of Climate Tech at JP Morgan, and also Simon Horner, Director of Strategy and Public Affairs at the Green Finance Institute. Please welcome them. I'm going to come down here and save everyone's necks, either staring up at me or kind of talking to the right. Just a pointer as well, there is some time for questions, so if anyone has a specific question they'd like to address to the panel, just shove your hand up. There are people with microphones around the room, so all I would ask is that you say where you're from. Please make it a question and not a statement, but say where you're from and who the question is directed to, so I'll try and leave some time. But good morning to you all. Thank you for being here. And Julia, I want to start with you because you were nodding along there to a lot of what Kate was telling us. And financing will be the key, quite clearly, that access to capital. So talk to me, first of all, if you will, about London's place in this and how London can provide some of that capital that is needed for this transition.
Well, it's a very good. I was nodding hugely to an awful lot of what was being said. I wish I could spend more time today here, actually. But so let me just start with a basic point. I run the stock exchange, and as a consequence, the thing I care about is something intensely boring, which is pipes and plumbing. And pipes and plumbing matters enormously in terms of the green transition. So we think about our role as a stock exchange. We always describe our role as a convener. Our job is to bring together those who have capital with those who need capital in service of an objective. And at the one-year anniversary of the ISSB standards for sustainable disclosures, S1 and S2 yesterday, I said that there is no greater objective for our generation than the just transition to net zero. In order to do that, you need to make sure that the relevant parts of the ecosystem are properly structured. We think of that as how do we enable capital that would flow to be properly identified as doing it for a sustainable purpose. So that's point one. The other issue is that actually as value changes, value carbon in a sense more and more, then actually there are new forms of value that are created, and you need to make sure that those pipes and plumbing work for that purpose as well. The next piece is actually convening the policy. So how do we make sure that there are the right structures and frameworks in place? And this matters particularly, I think, for the emerging world. One of the challenges, and I say this repeatedly, if getting to net zero was easy, we'd have got there already.
Yeah.
You know, we will fail a lot in the transition to get there. One of the things that markets like, and regulated markets like in particular, is clear rules and clear delineation. Thou shalt do this, disclose this, say this, etc. Now that's totally understandable, but you need space to iterate within that. And sometimes some of the rule structures don't allow for the fact that you've got very large global institutions who are actually already up to speed on disclosures at one end and new emerging technologies at the other end. One of the reasons we've been the advocate for both TCFD and ISSB is it's a global baseline rather than something that is sort of super equivalent and complicated and presuming we know all the answers. And I think that's one of the things as an exchange we have to absolutely advocate for.
But
and
how rare is it that we can say we don't have all the answers right now?
I think you have to.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a way of operating otherwise. I think the right regulatory environment is to create the space for failure. One of the things that I worry about in some of the disclosure requirements is that asset owners increasingly have to illustrate impact. Now, if you have to illustrate impact on a quarterly basis, you will invest in the low-hanging fruit. But I need people to be investing in the moonshots as much as the low-hanging fruit. And so as people who structure markets, or as people who have a mic in front of people who structure markets nowadays, then actually one of the things we need to advocate for is that flexibility to iterate and the recognition that we have to fail fast. The other issue is just making sure that people have the right access to data, but again, that's not so prescriptive that you cannot accommodate the changes that are needed and the demands of those who are just on a data gathering journey. Because what I fear is that the most complex institutions, possibly the ones that are emitting the most, have the best data. Yep. The ones that are actually creating the best change don't yet have the best data and therefore don't get access to capital. So in the UK, I think we've got a better framework than almost anywhere else in the world. We have TCFD as mandatory, ISSB will be mandatory from next year, transition plans are coming in, but it's all done from a baseline perspective to be as accommodative for the wider economy as possible and for the international issuers who issue on our markets too.
And when you talk about looking for those moonshots as well, it strikes me that so much of this is that intersection of so many different industries. Yep. It's technology, it's green tech, it's all of the climate goals thrown in one pot, and then we try and come out with some sort of solution. How willing is the international community to take those gambles and to take those risks? Because it's not proven technology in many cases.
Well, I think that's the reason we set up 3 discrete different ways of supporting financing into the green economy was for this very reason. So we have the sustainable bond market, which has both sustainable bonds, green bonds, blue bonds, transition bonds, etc. But we also have the green economy mark that is recognizing any company where over 50% of their revenues are coming from the green economy. Now, the reason for that is that's to stimulate equity investment. And actually, the closed-ended fund market in the UK has been investing in more of those moonshots, blue hydrogen and a host of other solutions to this than actually large other swathes of the economy. The other bit is we set up the first voluntary carbon financing market anywhere in the world 2 years ago to be ready for when, in a sense, everybody catches up. Yeah. Because if you think about voluntary carbon credit, the challenge was not trading them. The challenge was the creation of the investment into the projects that generated the carbon credits. So we created the world's first financing market to do that. And the idea there is that you can invest in technology that could be absolutely game-changing, does create a co-benefit, may not yet be economically viable, but we've given you the mechanism to do so. So our job is to be there and ready to create these exploitable mechanisms wherever we can. And actually the pipeline for both the green economy mark and for the voluntary carbon market, not just in the UK, but from companies all over the world, and particularly in the emerging world, is growing and growing. And my vision for the voluntary carbon market is actually the mechanism by which countries in the global south who have large carbon assets actually can, or carbon positive assets, can actually monetize them. Yeah. And we can do something we haven't done for a very long time. And I've been public about this for a long time. The global north has been very good at financing the global north. It's not been very good at financing the global south. Yeah. And this is one of the first opportunities we have to unlock that flow of funds as well.
I don't want to talk about that some more in just a moment, but let's bring in Neha at this point. And you know, we talk here about climate tech, and I think it'd be really helpful for us all at this stage to define what we mean by climate tech, because it's not just decarbonisation, it's not just sustainability targets. What is your definition of what climate tech involves?
We think about climate as almost every sector of the economy as it goes through that sustainable transition. So everything from built environment to the industrials to EVs to carbon markets, solutions which are across data analytics, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and tangentially also looking at nature, biodiversity, and then increasing the water. And my role is focusing on JP Morgan's innovation, climate tech solutions, which we are either customers for, and we want to partner and use a balance sheet to invest. And so particularly our focus is that intersection of climate and finance, which Julia touched on briefly, things like carbon markets, green commodities. And the lens we take is how can we develop the market infrastructure to help these solutions scale and get it to our customer, to our corporate clients, to our institutional investor clients. We are, as an institution, we've done a lot of our own decarbonization through our sustainability teams. And we're large buyers of things like engineered carbon removals. We've participated in Frontiers Buying Coalition. So teams like ours, and our perspective is how do we actually use that learnings for markets that are hugely complex to, we're one of maybe 10 buyers in the world who understand really complex markets. We have paid a premium in part in some of these areas. How do we actually scale that up? How do we embed it in our payments infrastructure? How do we collaborate with other institutions, other banks, and actually thinking about building that market infrastructure? So climate tech solutions are everything from sustainable finance, the intersection of climate and AI as we see LLMs being deployed across things like green bonds, trying to get that standardization in place, trying to read documents, whether that's project finance documents or energy documents, and trying to get that standardization. Everything from built environment solutions, which we've deployed across our own real estate assets, particularly in the US, as we have Chase branches to say, we have solutions that will help us measure and understand our footprint, but then also deploying sustainable materials. So climate is everything. We need to figure out what is actually the focus that will help us for the next few years and then into the future as we get into the hands of our clients.
Simon, let me bring you at this point too. Good morning. I was looking at a speech made by your chief executive talking about the systemic risk posed by climate crisis to specifically financial services, saying it requires decisive action. Just make that link for us between the climate crisis and financial services, if you will.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. Yeah, so I think the point around systemic risk is, there's two things going on in the way we think about, I think, regulating financial services. One is kind of that policy risk piece. So financial institutions pay really close attention to the way regulators and policymakers see the world. And certainly in the UK, we've got a very progressive central bank who's been thinking very carefully for a long time, and I would argue has led the debate on climate risk, certainly with stress testing and so on. And then the other part of it, and one might argue the more important part of it, is the actual sort of physical risk to portfolios in financial institutions, and that's where climate will actually degrade value in the businesses that you invest and lend to. So whether or not policymakers are regulating or not, if you don't manage your infrastructure, say you're setting up new factories or building supply chains which are likely to create, say, water shortages in the next 10 to 20 years. It doesn't matter what any government thinks about regulating sustainable finance. It matters that you'll run out of water, you'll lose any kind of political mandate from the local community because you've degraded the environment. And so it's bringing together at the right pace that relationship between the policy-making process and the physical risks that we're already starting to see. And I would argue what's missing and what we need to do more of is getting financial institutions to make decisions based on the physical risk and the impact on their bottom line, as opposed to just making decisions based on regulatory compliance. There's only so much that regulation can do here. At some point, it needs to be not the tail wagging the dog, which is an exercise in building big sustainability compliance and disclosure teams, and actually getting the C-suite to take it much more seriously and making investment decisions accordingly.
How convinced are you that that conversation that message has got through, that conversation is being had?
I think it is being had. I think we're probably more in the policy and compliance space than we are in the commercial decision-making space at the moment. I think one way to unlock it, though, is to think about ultimately what the upside is for investors. And so this whole thing shouldn't be a compliance exercise. This whole thing should be about opportunity. And so Julia mentioned that the Global North is really good at financing the Global North, which I think is true. And so if you take the 130 trillion that was notionally committed under GFANZ, that's really a Global North to Global North play. That's how can we make mostly listed companies in the Global North even greener, which is not a bad thing to do, but it's not going to move the needle on climate. And if you're chasing higher returns and you're willing to take on more risk, albeit in partnership with government, then you'll have to look outside the Global North anyway. And I think that's the step change, is developing that opportunity side, and that's how you'll get those decisions to be commercial and strategic as opposed to purely regulatory.
Yeah, and Julia, you're nodding along with all of that. What do you make of that?
Well, I totally agree. I do think there are certain nudges that become pushes in the small at the back, which are essential. It's a de minimis requirement that you've got the right regulatory framework. I also do think we need to move much more towards people saying this is the right thing for my business, for the long-term sustainability of it. I'm seeing more of that. Right. So more of the FTSE have science-based targets that they are committed to. We actually, at the Exchange, have created a Chief Sustainability Officer network, actually for people to share good practice and learnings, because these are corporates that are in the weeds of managing these issues and making sure that they are at the top table. And an increasing number of the CSOs are sitting on excos of these companies and are starting to drive the commercial decisions. So we're seeing that in real time. I also think that governments and regulators can be quite tactical about where they invest and where they don't. So I'll give you an example around voluntary carbon markets. One of the challenges we have is in verification. There's an awful lot of activity in the Global South that could be identified as a very high quality voluntary carbon credit if there was actually the capacity on the ground to do the verification and to identify the social care benefits, etc. But we don't have enough of them. And so we've been advocating very hard to government, rather than saying we're going to commit X billion to this one investment project, let's get the G20 together and just commit X 100 million to scaling the global capability to do this in each of the countries that are carbon positive, to actually pull that capital into those countries. Because the thing that the Global North needs is trust. That's what it needs to invest. And those are simple things to unlock, and they're going to be cheaper than some of the other big single ticket investments that people need to make.
What is still holding that back? Why is it still so difficult?
I struggle to know, if I'm honest. I think there is, the more people I talk to about this, the more there is utter consensus around that question.
So was it awareness?
I think some of it is that. And some of it is as with the regulatory decision in the UK that Mark Carney started with the bank and the FCA followed with TCFD being mandatory for listed companies, you're making a positive decision to step into a space. And I think policy certainty matters as well. And I think that is one of the things that governments need to be aware of. Investment can come if you know that there is a fixed timeline say for the transition to EVs or whatever, it actually does crowd in capital at that point because people all know what the level playing field is for the investment environment. And those are the sorts of things that governments can do that sometimes they slightly shy away from doing without realising that there's an accelerant effect that they create simply by creating that policy and putting it, and then sticking to it. Which is, I think, the other issue.
And Neha, is that your experience when you're speaking to clients? It's about having manageable timeframes and deliverable deadlines actually focuses the mind much more than, the common good.
I think exactly what Julia said. Like, we surveyed some of our top clients just over a year ago, and trust verification is the #1 issue to channel more capital into these markets, particularly carbon markets. Like, no one can quite agree on standards. It's a bit of a circular firing squad sometimes in the carbon markets, and clients need that framework in order to which to operate. And so, regulation, governments is all important. We think about our role as a financial institution that is influential, and how can we help? How can we come together with our peers? And peers are wider banks, other financial institutions, in starting to develop those frameworks. And that's a conversation that's been ongoing for a few years now.
And Simon, in all of this, there absolutely needs to be cooperation, collaboration between public and private sector. What is your sense of how much of that is happening right now and where the work needs to be done to bring those two together?
I think it's beginning to happen. I think Julia talked about the importance of the policy environment and also the trust gap. So I think if you try and draw a line between, say, one of those asset managers who's made a commitment under that $130 trillion and the project developer in India or in another market in the global south, if I'm that investor, like, who's my counterparty and who's going to explain what the policy environment is? How is it assured, if you like, for the next 10 or 20 years so that I can invest for the long term? Who can provide the sort of credibility on the demand side? So who's my off-taker if it's a power project, for example? And who is going to put in the slither or the tranche of development finance that I need to unlock the investment? Now, the good thing is that all of that exists somewhere, but if I'm an investor, I'm not going to be able to navigate it. The friction costs are simply too high. So we need new mechanisms to bring all of that together under one roof, new institutions, so that I basically, if I'm the investor in the global north, I have one counterparty who can say, this is the enabling environment, here's your PPA, here's a slither of blended finance, and then the capital will start to flow. And the other point I wanted to make, just on technology in particular, is the really important role of public capital. So public capital invests in first-of-a-kind technology, and there's a perception that that must be dumb money because they're investing where no private sector investor is deploying capital at the moment. But the question I'd ask is, what does that public capital provider know that the private sector doesn't know? What they know is exactly what I've just said, which is what is the policy environment they're investing behind, what is the business model that that government itself has designed, and who is the off-taker, who is the guarantor of that off-take agreement, all of that stuff. The government is in a much superior position to know that. So they can take on all of that first-of-a-kind risk. And if they do it strategically, not only can they make a return in funding that first project, but the next 9 projects can then be financed by the private sector. And I think that's the unlock that we need.
Quickly on those institutions that you said don't yet exist, what would they look like? What would that sort of institution be? Where would it be located? How would it work?
So I think what you need is an institution that's credible for both governments. So government will need to kind of invest or even divest some of its sort of powers and credibility into an institution to say, we will sort of advise you on the enabling environment. This is what you need to unlock private capital. And then that institution needs to have basically the commercial skill sets that will allow it to interact with the private investors. So it was beginning to take shape very informally under the JET-P process, but that was kind of very intermittent and not a sort of permanent institutional solution that a private investor could back. I think one really good example is in Indonesia. This is where the GFI has done a lot of its work, where building on the JET-P, they are actually working with us, setting up a new institution, if you like. They call it the National Committee on Sustainable Finance, but its role will be to coordinate financial policy, sector policy, demand side, technical assistance, blended finance, bring all of that together sector by sector and present that, if you like, to private capital. And that's, I think, when you've got a much more likely chance of unlocking serious investment at scale.
Neha, is any of this going fast enough? Because we talk about deadlines, we talk about the climate crisis, but it strikes me all of these institutions, all of this regulation, all of this transparency that we talk about takes time to enact. Are we going fast enough to meet the targets?
Definitely not. We're not deploying capital fast enough. And you know, as we've discussed several times, including, you know, in the morning at our breakfast meeting, like, the capital is there. It's a question of how you deploy it and what is, there are a balance of shareholder needs that you need to meet in order to deploy that capital. And the question is how you assess these risks on some of these projects. The biggest dialogue that we have at JP Morgan is how do you fund the transition? How do you bank projects that are not bankable? And how do you get that through? And so that comes with everything that Julia's mentioned as well, which is that standardization, you know, of the regulation, but it is definitely not going fast enough.
And Julia, a final thought from you on, you know, where is best practice? What does best practice look like? Because we're here at IGF. You know, what does India's regulatory framework look like to facilitate that flow of capital? What needs to change?
Well, as a former regulator, I make it a habit not to tell other regulators how to do their job. They're in Dragon's Light. But I'd say there's a broader point. India has a very significant financing need. Just, I think it's 2.5% of GDP in green financing just up to 2030. And then it moves into trillions for the energy transition as we get towards the target for net zero. And therefore, I think the key question is, as we get and accelerate towards that global sense of what the standard is, the more we're thinking about these as global financing markets, the better. I was reflecting on it just now in terms of the question you had about pace. One of the things I worry about where regulation is too didactic, as it were, is it presumes you already know the answer to the question, and we don't. But the slower we go now, the more ambitious we need to be, and the more focused on moonshots we need to be thereafter. And that means as much globally distributed effort as possible, which means that we also need to be making sure that there are global financing markets and global flows of capital. One of the things that we're actually going to do at the end of this year, or September of this year, is bring together an India Clean Energy and Climate Transition Finance Summit at the Exchange to showcase some of the Indian companies that are doing remarkable things to try and crowd in some of that capital. But I think we have to do that on a global basis. And any good idea is one that we kind of all want to have the capacity to back. I think sometimes where markets think of themselves as closed environments, you minimize the chance of that cross-fertilization. So I think actually opening up more of an opportunity for Indian companies to get capital and therefore the support, the sponsorship and the feedback from global investors in this ecosystem is probably one of the biggest shifts that needs to happen.
Really does feel like seeing is believing, doesn't it, as well? Thank you. Our time is up, but thank you so much for being with us. Ladies and gents, please put your hands together for Julia, for Neha and for Simon. Thank you. Sure.
We've come a long way to get to where we are today. From what started as a single dream to enabling millions of dreams. From a handful of experts to thousands in our team. From two-wheeler to becoming a financing leader. We cover the length and breadth of our nation. As India moves forward, we move forward. With resilience, resolve and determination. With a focus on digital and innovation. We are relentless in our drive as we strive to meet and exceed the evolving needs of being Bharat ka digital lender. In a market filled with increasing choice, we needed to find our unique brand voice. As part of our journey to tell our growth story, we spoke to people across the country, covering all our stakeholders from customers, channel partners and employees. We sought inspiration in their values and aspirations. We breathe new life in our brand identity, framing human stories through windows of opportunity, reflecting our vision to empower upward mobility, broadening horizons through financial accessibility. Our loans symbolize a dose of confidence, the confidence to make it happen. the confidence to take action, to form collaborations, to go further than we have ever before, to become an inspiration and hero to all. Hero FinCorp, the confidence to make it happen.
I want us to look next at the opportunities and challenges in actually diversifying our energy mix, not just relying on renewables. So to set the scene for the new challenge, please welcome Sumant Sinha, who's the founder and chief executive and chairman of Renew India, Rahul Munjal, who's the chairman, managing director at Hero Energies, and also Dr. David Kingham, executive vice chairman at Tokamak Energy. Welcome. Good morning. Good morning to you all. Thank you for being with us. And we talked a little bit earlier, didn't we, Rahul, about green hydrogen. And I'm going to start there if I can, because I'm looking at all the quotes that I've done some research about. The key player in the future of sustainable energy, the most significant technological advancement to make this scalable and economically viable. Give me your assessment of where we are right now, Rahul, on green hydrogen.
If you don't mind, I'm going to take a step back first and talk a little bit about renewables, because I know we're going to talk about green hydrogen a lot more in the panel. Everything we can electrify, we should electrify, because we found a way to decarbonize the grid already through renewables. So I just want to lay it out there. 30 to 40% of emissions come from electricity from the grid, which we can decarbonize. So while hydrogen is important, electrifying what we can is the most important thing, and everything that we've electrified, moving into renewables is equally important. So let just that be the starting of the conversation. But now moving on, where does green hydrogen come in? Is green hydrogen the silver bullet that we've all been looking for, and does it have the promise that it's all hyped up to be? In certain sectors, yes, it does. For green hydrogen, today, most of India is not built out already, or not built out yet, right? Most of Africa is not built out yet. People need homes, people need roads, schools, hospitals, cement. So there is going to be a lot of C&I sectors. So how do you green cement? How do you green steel? You use hydrogen. What else do you use hydrogen for? Transportation, for shipping. What else can you do with hydrogen? Aeroplanes. So hydrogen has its place, but it's not the only silver bullet that we have, but it's here and now. At least in smaller projects, it's here and now. Large scale, not yet.
That was my question. It has its limitations, though, doesn't it? Talk to me, first of all, about the limitations, and then we might address how we get a bit beyond them.
Yeah. So there are 2 or 3 ways of looking at hydrogen and its limitations. The first is hydrogen is a volatile fuel. You know, we don't know what it, it doesn't have a smell, it doesn't have an odor. So if there's a leak, it could be dangerous. It's hard to transport. You need to first convert it into ammonia or to methanol. So you can't transport it the way it is. And secondly, the energy density is really, really low. You need 18 vans to transport the same, or 18 lorries or what have you, to transport the same fuel, wherein for diesel you'll need 1. Yeah. So imagine you have 18 of them pulling into a petrol station rather than just 1. It's a very different ballgame. We've not put our head around. While people say they can store hydrogen, and I'm sure they can, but it's still early days. So first is storage around hydrogen, and the second is the electrolyzers themselves at large scale, and not only at large scale, at high efficiencies, are not proven yet. So we're getting there, we're just not there yet.
Sumant, let me bring you in here as well. You know, where are you most excited about the new developments in renewables? Because there's so much focus on what we might deem to be the traditional renewables. Where are you looking? What is your main focus right now?
Yeah, hi. So I do tend to agree with Rahul a little bit that, one step at a time. And that first step really is to decarbonize the electricity sector. There's a bit of an echo.
Yeah, do you want to try this other one as well? Let's sort these out. Let's try that one.
Yeah. So first of all, we have to decarbonize the electricity sector as best as possible. And there the news is good in that you have a lot of different kinds of solutions from a cost standpoint that are already cheaper than fossil fuels. The big issue, of course, is there are 2-3 infirmities. One, of course, is the fact that it's variable. The second, that you need to build out the grid much more in most countries, and that is going to take time. But I think there are solutions that are becoming available for firming up renewables, which is the biggest disadvantage. And you can do that, of course, through a combination of wind and solar and some degree of storage. And in India, we've already got now what we call round-the-clock renewable energy projects, where we are able to provide not 30% plant load factor based solutions, but almost 80 to 85% PLF solutions, which is almost like firm power. And we're able to do that at a price that is much cheaper than coal-based power, just by combining wind, solar, and storage together. But we have 2 advantages in India that are not there in most other countries. One, that we have a single grid that links the entire country across its length and breadth. And that means that we can use the best locations in the country for solar and the best locations in the country for wind, and we can combine them together virtually and ship them to some other third part of the country altogether, right? So I think that's one incredible advantage. And the second is that wherever we have overflow power, which you will have in this kind of a product, we can sell that into the merchant market. And there's a very active merchant market right now. And so that allows us to really come up with very different kinds of solutions through renewable energy. So it's not just a question of how you generate the renewable or what source you generate it from, but it's also how you then match it together and use it to create different kinds of products. And it's now got to a point where if the utility asks us to provide peak power or 100% availability at peak times in the morning and peak times in the evening and 50% at all other times, we can sculpt that too. And so that actually takes the ability for us to use renewables and penetrate into the grid to a far superior level than we've had so far. And that in some way addresses one of the biggest problems, right? The second thing, of course, is that in terms of what you said, where am I looking? You know, our sector keeps changing so dramatically and so rapidly on a very regular basis that it's actually quite interesting. 2 years ago, solar module prices were about 20 to 25 cents, coming out of China mostly, right? Today, those prices have fallen to 10 or 11 cents. Who could have anticipated that? Which essentially means the price of solar has come down by almost 40 to 45% in the last 2 years itself. And therefore, the ability to use solar in the grid changes dramatically, right? At the same time, battery prices are also coming down very rapidly. And as that happens, you now have the ability of actually storing more of your solar and extending it out to the evening hours and thereby meeting the evening peak as well. And so, again, the penetration of renewables at low cost is really, really increasing quite substantially. Now, to answer your other question around hydrogen, which, of course, you'd asked Rahul, but to give you my perspective on that, one of the issues that we have right now is that the reason renewables is successful in the electricity part of the energy segment, but green hydrogen is going to struggle a little bit, is because today renewables is competing, in India at least, with coal-based power, which is a lot more expensive, and therefore we can do all sorts of interesting things that I was talking about earlier with renewables. But in the case of green hydrogen unfortunately is almost 2.5 times the cost of gray hydrogen. Yeah. And so the question is, why should anybody want to use green hydrogen if they don't have to? And this is really where government policy comes in. You need to have subsidies on the one hand, or you need to have mandates on the other hand, or a pricing for carbon. And none of those is happening at the speed and pace at which we need right now, unfortunately. And so therefore, you'll see that the German HINDCO tender, the green hydrogen subsidy program there, in Japan, the green hydrogen subsidy program, or in the US, where for other reasons, none of those programs are moving at the pace at which we require.
And I want to come on to the drivers, but also that accessibility, because as you said, it will come down to cost ultimately as well. I want to bring Dr. David in at this point too. And I wonder, David, where does fusion fit into this picture? We've talked a lot about hydrogen and renewables, but where's fusion fit in?
Well, I think many technologies are going to be essential to tackle the increasing demand for energy and the climate change challenge. So we look at India, we think tenfold increase in energy consumption over the next 20 to 30 years, huge decarbonisation challenge, and the technology we're working on, fusion energy, has the capability to be developed and deployed at scale within that 20 to 30 year timeline and make a big impact on decarbonising. But it is not yet a developed technology. We need collaborations and partnerships internationally to develop it as quickly as possible. So my company, Tokamak Energy, 250 people based just south of Oxford. We've raised about $300 million of capital so far, but this is a multi-$10 billion problem, challenge, and opportunity. And at the moment, we're looking for stronger partners in India to help us develop the partnerships necessary to develop and deploy the technology. We already have a great dialogue with the Indian Institute for Plasma Research. It turns out their roadmap towards fusion is very similar to the approach we're taking, and we think that offers potentially great opportunity to accelerate development of fusion energy.
So quite aside from funding, what would those partnerships offer you? What would they look like?
So we're currently engaged in several partnerships around the world. To give you one example, in the US, the US Department of Energy has a milestone-driven fusion development program. And the idea there is that one company comes forward with a technology proposition and gathers around supporters from the national laboratories, from big industry, to develop that technology. And the goal there in 10 years is to get to a 50 megawatt pilot plant. So there's a race between 8 companies. Tokamak Energy is one of them. And we're building that collaboration with that 10-year to a pilot plant goal. In Japan, somewhat different approach. The Japanese government has a moonshot program. Or the word moonshot's been mentioned a couple of times already. But the Japanese government have said, it may take a bit longer than other countries think. We want our industry to be positioned well to deploy the technology, but we also want fusion to be useful within 10 years. And so we're involved in partnerships and collaborations there.
So let's talk, and this is applicable to all of you, what is the carrot, what is the stick here in terms of the drivers and incentives for this transition to happen? You talked about cost, but Rahul, what are the drivers and incentives for you?
Yeah, so before we, this is something I spoke about even at the breakfast meeting, and I'll say it again, and something I believe in deeply. I prefer carrots, and I don't prefer sticks. And for a very simple reason, because if you heard the government speak earlier during the day, we want to be inclusive, and the cost needs to come down. And today, not only in India, but most parts of the world, we stay in a very high inflation. These are very high inflationary times.
Yeah.
So if you want to keep the cost down, let's not tax anything. Let's incentivize instead. So you keep the cost down for everybody rather than keep the cost up for everybody.
Can governments afford that though?
But they'll, so the point is between winning elections and losing elections. So maybe they'll want to, especially in this country, right? Because inflation is not in control, and we know how the election's going to go in I guess, a couple of weeks from now. Mm-hmm. So maybe in democracies where inflation is important, they would like to keep it down. And if you want to keep it down, one way is to incentivize rather than tax and make it expensive for everybody. So that's just one thought out there. But having said that, we need to incentivize technologies which are long gestation. Certain technologies like renewables do not need incentives. The kind of programs Sumant just spoke about, the load flow program that we are winning in with wind, solar, battery storage, etc. So we made infirm power into firm power. We do not need incentives for the grid anymore, to decarbonize the grid, but we need the grid.
Yep.
There is no grid available anywhere in the world. Almost every country in the world that I go to, the two problems are grid connection and government orders, or just the commissioning, or the licenses. So these two problems are common throughout the globe when it comes to renewables. It's not the money, it's not the resources, it's not the cost of capital, it's not the intention. It's just not enough actual land and actual grid. So we need to solve for those. When it comes to projects like the one Doctor spoke about here, you need capital which is patient capital. You need to merge that patient capital along with investor expectations. There are certain investors who want high returns and they want them now. Yep. So that capital is not coming here. Yep. So where is this capital coming from? Is there pools of government money which can be allocated here, which have extremely long term and low to medium cost, They probably are. But they might not work for other industries and other businesses. And I feel hydrogen today is somewhere in the middle, where it's attracting some private equity money as well as some government money. The government money is coming in maybe in places like Japan and the US, and the stick is coming in Europe. So there is everything which is coming in is carrot, stick, public money and private money in hydrogen today.
Yeah, I mean, David, you're nodding along, you're smiling with that. I wonder what the conversations are like that you have about, you need to scale, you need to prove this technology, and you need quite a lot of work, right?
Yeah.
Where are you in those conversations?
Well, we do like the approach that's being taken by the US Department of Energy. It's a competitive race to fusion energy. We think that stimulates investment, it stimulates good progress.
Does it bring collaboration or just competition?
It certainly brings collaboration as well, because if one company out of 8 decides it's going to not collaborate, it's going to suffer. So the collaborations are being established among the players in the race. But the US has also decided that it wants to be quite internationalist about development of fusion energy, and I think that's important. It can't be just a technology perfected in one country and deployed just there. Because it's safe, with minimal proliferation risk, no risk of meltdown, no long-lived radioactive waste, it is inherently attractive globally. And so it needs to be made available globally. And that's really, part of the challenge and the opportunity.
And Suman, you said in that previous answer about these new technologies, these new innovations that are being made available, but not for all. And I wonder what those barriers are. Clearly, cost is one of them, but we know costs are coming down, accessibility is coming down. But this is still a really difficult area to give universal access to. How are you navigating that with the company?
You mean universal access to end customers?
Both. I mean, I suppose it's the conversations you're having around financing and funding, but also for end customers about how are they going to get this stuff? Because we talk about incentives, the carrot and stick approach. Actually, one of the biggest incentives is clearly access and price, right?
Yeah, look, my view is that we don't have time, right? As you posed a question to the previous panel about do we have enough time and are we going fast enough? And we all clearly know that we're not going fast enough. And so we need to really step up substantially what we're doing right now. And that needs both a carrot and a stick approach, I think. Unless you come out with mandates, nobody is voluntarily going to shift if they don't have to, right? And you've seen the whole oil and gas industry a couple of years ago and a year ago taking tentative steps towards renewables. The markets just said, you know what, we're not going to reward you for it, so they've all stepped back from it. And we need their capital as well, apart from everybody else's capital. So I think we need just, we need maybe a global pricing on carbon. Every user industry that emits carbon should be paying for it. And that money then needs to be used to invest in carbon-free technologies like fusion, for example. Otherwise, where's that capital going to come from? Eventually, if the US Department of Energy is going to fund it, then that technology is going to be IP'd by them. What is that going to then do to the justness of the transition? And how is that going to get to a lot of the other emerging market countries where we also need to have that transition? So I think you need to have a mandate, a strong mandate. And of course, government policy has to also play a very strong role in other areas. As Rahul was saying, building out the grid. I think it's very simple. If today you use 100 units of power coming from coal and you're going to replace that whole thing with solar, solar is not going to give you 100 units of power through the course of the day. It's going to give you 300 in the middle of the day and nothing after that. So you need now 3 times the grid, actually, to transmit that power. And you need 200 units of storage, equivalent, right? So therefore, you need very fundamental shifts in the way our entire electricity system is geared today. It's all actually geared towards the thermal sector, which is how, obviously, we've all evolved. And so there are lots of legacy issues that have to be dealt with. And those require a very different mindset. Those require also very large amounts of capital to be invested fresh off the bat. And so therefore, we need very radical solutions, which we don't have. One of the other things around capital that, again, you asked what kind of institution do we require in the future. I think we need to totally redesign our financial architecture. I don't think that the existing multilaterals are going to solve the problem because they're geared with a very different mandate, which is poverty alleviation. Now, you ask the same set of people to suddenly shift to lending in the climate space, they don't necessarily have the internal processes and systems or even the mandate from their shareholders or the expertise to make that change. So you need to actually set up brand new institutions that can do all of this. But when you look at the state of geopolitics in the world right now, it's a little bit disheartening. There's very little global cooperation taking place. This year, just to give you an example, in Delhi, we had the record for consecutive days of 40 degrees plus temperature in the summer was 30. This year, we not only broke that record, but we got up to 40. We had 40 consecutive days of 40 degrees centigrade temperature change. And the temperature went up to 47, 48 degrees centigrade. Right? It's impossible humanly to be outside and doing any kind of work, right? Or even just to go outside. And those kinds of things are happening now more and more. And we all need to, and I don't have to evangelize this, of course, because we're all in the same boat.
Well, that's an appropriate point for a final question to David and Rahul. In terms of that time frame, we know the problem is here. That's quite clear. How quickly does it take to scale both technologies, be it fusion or green hydrogen, to a point that this is a practical application, it is affordable, it is accessible, it is usable? David, let me start with you first. What are we talking here?
I think we're talking second half of the 2030s for scalable, rapid deployment of fusion.
Right.
So we're aiming to build the collaborations, the partnerships that would enable that rapid deployment once the pilot plant is proven. But it's a huge challenge.
And the challenge is having people with you with that long-term mindset?
The sheer scale of the challenge, I think, is the problem that energy technologies take a while to scale up. Supply chains take a while to develop. And we can do some preparation of that now, but the large flows of capital necessary to really stimulate and deploy will be waiting there to see pilot plants working. And then it'll trigger a rush.
So, if I can just interject for a second. Unfortunately, by the time fusion becomes a practical reality, the climate change battle would have been won or lost. Now, of course, beyond that, it'll be very good to get fusion at low cost because we'll obviously need more energy. But at least as far as climate change is concerned, that would be in the rearview mirror by that time.
And so then, Rahul?
So I'm a bit of a climate optimist, so I'll change the narrative a little bit. So I think green hydrogen for cement, steel, other C&I, as well as for shipping, is a reality by 2030 at some scale, and by 2040 at a much, much larger scale. And SAF for fuel for airplanes, maybe by mid-2030s, we'll see it becoming fairly common.
I get so into this, yes, I need to make sure we have some time for questions. Yeah, let someone bring a microphone to you. Please say where you're from and who it's directed to on the panel.
Sure. So Cormac Jackson, Chief of Staff to Dheeraj Mukherjee. Fascinating discussion. This is addressed to all of you because you had some discussion about green hydrogen. I just wondered, is there like an understanding of where we are on the flywheel, in the sense that I feel like with solar, it's kind of clear that, more investment's going to lower the prices, we kind of have a good idea. But with green hydrogen, is it that we know, okay, roughly this much investment, we can expect this kind of result? Or is it we still have a lot of, policy and technology unknowns, if that makes sense?
So there are, sorry,
that one's horrible.
There clearly are policy unknowns as well. Right? I mean, technology unknowns because electrolyzer efficiency will keep improving as we go forward. But the bulk of the cost of green hydrogen is renewable electricity. And that cost has already come down a lot. And it will go down in the future, but not at the same pace at which we've seen reductions in the past. So if today green hydrogen is anywhere from $3 to $4 a kg, depending on the jurisdiction and stuff like that, and the cost of grey hydrogen is $1, then to get it from $3 to $4 down to $1.5, I don't see a clear path towards that. So in my view, green hydrogen will remain more expensive than grey hydrogen for quite some time in the future. And therefore, we need to have people being either subsidized or mandated to move from grey to green. Otherwise, that shift is not going to take place at the level and speed at which we require. And yes, I do agree with Rahul that by 2030, you'll start having many more plants coming up. But the scale and speed that we require, that is not showing up. And today, we should have already had multiple green hydrogen projects in actual construction. But we actually only have just the one that was started 2 years ago. And we don't have offtake contracts. We don't have any active conversations with a lot of people. Subsidy programs are moving very, very slowly. So it's going to take a while for the whole sector to get started.
Thank you. And there's one more question from the back of the room, I think, as well. And then I'll hand over.
Hi, my name is Divakar. Qualifications as an engineer, but working as a recycling professional over the past 25 years. And I think I came to the India Global Forum largely because I think the British and Indian coming together can bring like a great thought leadership as well as traction to ideas. One of the things that happens in life is things are lost in translation. Whereas in previous discussions we did talk about plastics, we forget that plastic is a byproduct of fossil fuel consumption, whereas what is being promoted as maybe fabric or anything is an extremely water-intensive project. So a kilo of cotton will require like 5, 6, 7,000 liters of water. So I think narratives, how they are told, especially when Rahul just mentioned that it takes 18 trucks to give the same energy density as 1 truck of diesel, is very interesting. So coming the same way, I think hydrogen has a lot of corrosive properties, and maybe what we need to look at is not large-scale hydrogen plants, but little hybrid mushroom plants that can serve smaller circles of consumption.
I'm going to make that into a question. Is that the answer? Smaller ones?
It's not the answer, but it's a stepping stone. You'll have to do some smaller projects. You know, when we started off, when we started off, we used to do 2, 4, 5, 10 megawatt projects. Today, if you ask us to do a smaller project, less than a couple of 100 megawatt, we'd probably frown upon it. We'll do it, but we'll frown upon it. So yeah, we probably have to start small, and the small use cases will be very different because they'll be in C&I rather than in shipping, etc.
Wonderful. Our time is up. Thank you. So Rahul, to Suman, and to Dr. David, thank you so much for being with us. I'll hand over to Nisha. Thank you.
Really interesting. So, ladies and gentlemen, wasn't that an interesting discussion? I always thought that fusion was something that was going to happen in my children's lifetime. Now it looks like it's going to happen in our lifetimes, and maybe might even sort out some of the biggest problems that we have. Really interesting stuff. And the fact that it's happening, some of it's happening in Oxford, not far from here, that's good to know. So what are we going to discuss next? We are going to talk about a subject that we all have opinions on, and that is e-vehicles. I'm sure many of you have thought, is it time to buy? No, etc. This is your time to put your questions to our panelists, because we are not going to be able to decarbonize without massively cleaning up the transport sector. It's responsible for some 25% of global emissions. We have got to electrify it. How fast can we get there? What are the constraints going to be? That's what we're going to be discussing now. Let me introduce you to our panelists. From Jaguar Land Rover, we're delighted to welcome Director of Public Affairs, Murray Paul. Murray, where are you? Make yourself comfortable. We've all heard of Jaguar Land Rover, right? Now, you may not have heard of Peak Mobility, which is a very cool business model. Let me introduce you to the founder, Zach Fairzel. Zach, please, welcome. And from a consultancy, Roland Berger, the global lead for e-mobility, is joining us. I think he just flew in from Dubai. Arvind CJ. Mr. Arvind, please. I'm going to take the example of Ben and stand over here, if you don't mind, so that we're not all kind of in one line. Panelists, may I ask you to ignore me and please speak here, right? Because otherwise, it's hard to tell what people are saying. So the first thing I'm going to ask our panelists to do is just tell us what they are doing currently, and then we can look at some of the constraints on really accelerating EV ownership and deployment. So if I may start with you, Murray, I'm going to ask you a cheeky question. So the first thing you think about when you think about EVs is not Jaguar Land Rover, right? I looked it up, and they only have one model on the market right now. So what are your ambitions? Why are you late to the game?
I wouldn't characterize it as late. I think it's all about timing. Different manufacturers are a different size and can adopt different strategies. And whilst we're a very well-known brand in the UK, we're actually a relative minnow on the global stage of EV. So it's all about timing your entry onto the market and making sure you get that right. I fully accept from an external view of you just look at our website configure and what do we sell. You could suggest that we're late. If you're inside our business, there is literally nothing else we are working on. So we will go from a position of one EV on the market today to by 2026, 80% of all cars that we will sell on the market will be have an EV available on them. By 2030, 80% of all cars that we will sell globally will be electric vehicles. So,
wow, that's a massive transition for Jaguar Land Rover.
A huge step change in what is relatively a short period of time, and it comes back to what I said at the start. It's about timing your entry onto the market.
Right. So you think it's better to wait till the market gets some lift off and then really fully embrace it?
For a business our size.
Right. Right.
It won't make sense to a much larger business that's able to transition its portfolio gradually over time.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk in a little while about how to get the market to lift off, right? Zach Fezer. So peak mobility, tell us a little bit about it. It's a bit of a different approach from what I can make out. You're recycling existing petrol and diesel engines. What's the logic?
Yeah, it's pretty unconventional. It's not the norm. But I think with anything of the scale of climate, it's pretty important that we question the status quo. And for us in particular, when we looked at the transport industry, we had to look at the practicalities of it, right? So we have 1.6 billion cars. The goal is by 2030, 30% should be electric. Today we're at 3%. To any typical OEM, I think Murray can correct me, but it takes about 3 to 4 years to develop a brand new car from scratch. It takes about 3 or 4 years to set up a gigafactory from scratch. So when we have 6 years left and 500 million electric cars put on the road, practically does it seem possible? So that's one big issue that I saw. The second is the results. I mean, if you look at the transport sector emissions over the last 3 years, we're up 3%. Even though we're seeing a massive EV boom that we call, there's still a massive increase in emissions.
So are you seeing interest in this idea of recycling existing cars?
I think more than interest, it's a realization, because everyone is realizing you can't look at electrification in a singular lens. You need to have multiple alternative solutions, and repurposing mobility is not the end goal, but it is a perfect transitionary solution. It's affordable, it's practical, and it's immediate.
So you call it repurposing?
Yeah, so our goal is to repurpose as many vehicles as we can to electric. Okay,
and advantages of that, apart from speed, is it cheaper?
Absolutely. So when you manufacture a car, it's usually built for 25, 30 years. We often discard it after 10, 15. We repurpose that important asset. So it's 30% more affordable, 30% less emissions, and a fraction of the time.
Sounds good, right? Let's find out a bit more about what Arvind is working on, and Roland Berger. A big project in Saudi to try and create a whole auto infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. Now, do they have any car building expertise in Saudi at the moment?
No, unfortunately, right? So that's the short answer, but that's essentially what the challenge which we are, let's say, taken on right now. So what's happening right now is that the whole of Middle East is trying to transition away from oil, right? So even from an economic perspective. And what that is kind of leading to is that they want to look at automotive manufacturing as one of the key pillars for this economic diversification. The good part, also a bit confusing in my view is that they have fully gone towards electric vehicle production rather than, let's say, focusing a bit on ICE and so on. And given that they don't have, let's say, the typical, let's say, existing infrastructure of, let's say, ICE production and so on, they've been able to kind of avoid that step entirely and move into like fully battery electric vehicles today. And again, it's not only, let's say, the battery electric which they're talking about, they're also looking at hydrogen fuel cell related mobility and all of it. And they are fundamentally working with some of the new age, let's say, manufacturers and the conventional manufacturers to kind of get this scale within, let's say, the Middle East.
And what are the challenges of creating an auto industry from scratch? I mean, Jaguar Land Rover, yeah, they have created a plan and decided it makes sense to start a bit later because you want a market to be established. But they have been building cars in Coventry for a very long time, right? So how do you start a whole industry from scratch?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a bit of a cost disadvantage or a capability disadvantage which you start off with. At the same time, given the kind of, let's say, talent migration which happens these days, it's not such a difficult thing either. So the goal is that you are able to partner with, let's say, the global OEMs to bring that capability in and also train the local people. So that's the reason why you have specific academies now which have been purpose-built for this one, let's say for the automotive sector, to kind of, let's say, build the capabilities locally. And we see this happening not only in automotive, for aerospace and a few other areas as well. This is something which is happening. So quite an exciting time for, let's say, the whole of Middle East in terms of the transition for them to go into manufacturing of electric vehicles.
Well, it's good to hear. The more people in the market, the better. So how is the market going to really get liftoff in the timelines that we have? Cost is an issue. They are more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles. The market is clearly not pushing us towards buying EVs unless you live in certain countries like Norway. So I want to ask you, Murray, what are your thoughts on the current cost disadvantage of EVs, and how can we use either government interventions or novel business models to try and make it more attractive to consumers to go this way?
So I suppose the understanding the drivers, I mean, you spoke a little bit about it when you started. Transport emissions are the single largest sector of emissions. Passenger car within that is the single largest segment within transport emissions. So, we as an organisation and an industry absolutely recognise that. And I don't know any car company that disagrees with that. We may disagree about the journey to get there, but we don't disagree about that. And I think the same is true for governments. That you see around the world various mandates and regulations that places a burden on the industry to increase car sales year on year for electric vehicle. And that's great, but what it usually fails to address is the consumer in it, the person that actually is going to put their hand in his or her wallet and make that purchasing decision to go and buy the cars.
Exactly.
And the status quo is that a battery is significantly more expensive today than an internal combustion engine, by almost a factor of 2. And to manage this transition, we must operate profitable businesses. We can't trade away those margins, and certainly for the mass car market, those margins don't exist to trade away in the first place. They're operating on a really small margin. So we do have an imbalanced equation that we need to solve in there. And it's all very well telling consumers, well, the total cost of ownership is much better if you drive an EV, but the hurdle to get in there, if it's too high to unlock the savings in the first place.
So the running costs are low, but the upfront cost is much more expensive.
And over the lifetime of the vehicle, it will be lower, but if you can't get into it in the first place.
Yeah.
So we need interventions to make that happen, and I'll give you 3 good examples of where interventions work, and that applies in the UK as much as it does anywhere else in the world. The first is, providing incentivisation. If we look at this country, for example, we've got incentivisation if you're a company car owner, we give you really low, if not zero, benefit-in-kind rates. And we see that directly driving market behaviour. But that doesn't exist for the private consumer, and we see the complete, reverse of the situation, where it's 30% penetration for fleet sales, it's 10% for things. So we can help in that respect. We also need to look all the way other at the...
We can help, meaning?
Giving help to the consumers to lower the price of the car in there, so that they, whether it's through VAT or something like that.
The government making sure that there are incentives.
Yes,
okay.
that's one, because
All right.
we're in a climate race, aren't we? The second is we need to establish the value of these batteries. And that's all about understanding the recycled value of the batteries. And why does that make sense to unlocking that? Well, if we can establish the value of the batteries and the recycled content of that batteries, and it reaches a stable, good price, it becomes more valuable to the insurer if that car's written off, which means that your premium will be lower when you go into the car, but it also increases the residual value of that car. And that residual value is a big determining factor on the finance that you're able to get into the car in the first place. So those things will lower the cost. And the final thing is the charge network. Having a high quality, high class charge network that's ubiquitous, it works everywhere, and you don't get any range anxiety, will increase the confidence. But also what it says to us as the consumer is, we don't need to engineer out the inefficiencies of a charge network. We can actually put smaller batteries in our car. We don't need to cater for 95% of all your use cases, because you're worried about
which
the charge
might bring
network,
down the price of the car.
which will bring down the
Very
price of the
interesting
car.
point. Thank you so much, Mari, and that was really clearly put. I saw you nodding your head there, Zach Faisal. Was it about the charge network? Was it about the costs? What are your thoughts on how we can make EVs more affordable?
No, absolutely. I think incentives is obviously a big part of it, but I think a smarter way to tackle it is to look at the whole charging infra problem we have. And I think a great metric to understand is number of EVs per charging station. And India, for example, is 135 cars per charging station. UAE is 80 per one charging station. The UK has done a phenomenal job. There are 23, but China's at 2.
Oh, wow.
So if governments can push up number of charging stations per car, that's going to force the manufacturers to have smaller battery packs in the car, bringing in affordability to the vehicle. And I think that's a smarter way to go about it.
So you're saying that the government needs to pay for this. It has to be, the charging network needs to be subsidized with public money before EV penetration is really going to take off. Yeah?
I think so. I think there needs to be a bit more of a balance in the split in investment. So last year alone, there was about $500 billion committed to EV manufacturing, but less than 100 on charging. I think if there can be a bit more balance on that, we could.
Thanks, Zach. So I know there are questions bubbling up there, but I just want to put one thing to Arvind, not about cost and affordability, and that is the power grids, right? We're going into this all-electric world. Everyone wants power for everything. We know we are having power cuts all around India right now because of the heat waves. Are the grids going to cope?
Yeah, so maybe on that particular point, right? So not only with respect to grids, but even in terms of, let's say, reducing the cost of ownership and so on. It's the time for new business models, right? So we need disruptive business models, or we need disruptive solutions all through. And what we are seeing again and again from, let's say, an ownership perspective is subscription models are becoming a bit more of, let's say, an offering, not only from the OEMs directly, but also you have independent agencies which are starting to do it. Now, why subscription models also start making sense is because the car fundamentally is changing every year or every 2 years, right? So you buy a car, you typically try to have it for 5 to 8 years kind of a timeline. But whereas if you keep waiting for that, there is definitely a better and a newer model which is coming in. So if you kind of take this example of a cell phone where you do keep changing it frequently, you cannot do that with a car.
But
with a subscription model, that's fundamentally.
So that's a different funding model. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
But through subscription, you're also kind of reducing the upfront, let's say, the hurdle which is there, and that would make also EVs affordable, right? So definitely there are different things which are being looked at, and that extends to the grid aspect as well. So it's not that the grids today are completely, let's say, ready to accommodate all the EV penetration which we are targeting, but what that also means is in terms of rooftop solar or some sort of, let's say, the parking-related energy generation and so on, those are the models which need to start kicking in so that you don't have everything back into the grid, but there are certain remote solutions or, let's say, decentralized solutions which are available to kind of fuel this particular part. And that's
Thank you so much, Arvind. I know we've got a question over here. Can we get a mic here really quickly, Malaki? Tell us who you are. Just a question, not a statement, please. That's my request to you.
My name is Chanakya. I'm with a climate think tank called Green Alliance. My question is to the big car manufacturing companies, and I think Zach would be a good answer to that. But do you think like the car manufacturing companies need to reduce their resource use, as in that they need to discard less cars and maybe have a bit more flexibility to retrofit the internal combustion engines to the electric vehicles? Like Zach, I think Zach's idea is pretty good. So you think big companies should also do that?
Murray.
What is a given in what we're doing is trying to create a circular economy. So we start from that position, absolutely. What's not in our line of sight, fully respect what Zach's trying to achieve is retrofitting old cars to a different propulsion technology than they were designed for in the first place, because then you've got a huge amount of inefficiency from a complete design perspective that you're trying to work around in order to deliver a proposition to the customer that they need and want. Now, that will be different across different car companies. We are a luxury brand, and we need to play in that luxury market, so that what comes out of us. But I do know Renault, for example, have a factory in France that takes old cars off the road and increases the value of them by putting the latest engine technology, the latest emissions technology, reupholstering the car and selling it as a refreshed car. And it's those sort of circular economy things that all car companies will be looking like, because, and especially when we talk about the batteries, these cannot be single-use discarded things. We need to find ways of getting all of that chemistry out of that battery and into the supply chain again. So I know I've not answered your question directly, but I hope it give you a flavour of the sort of things we're looking at.
Thanks, Murray. One quick question.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Zara. I'm an AI and frontier tech expert, and I serve on several boards. My question is, as you know, our Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is a big advocate of electric. What advice will you give to him?
To get Londoners to, already you don't have to pay if you've got an EV. You don't have to pay the ULEZ to get in and out.
Maybe a quick statement on this one, right? So I think the way London has tackled this, let's say, the overall public transportation versus private ownership part, that's essentially the way forward for most of the cities. So it's not that decarbonization of transportation is going to happen through having just electric vehicles which are just private owned, right? So the whole movement towards, again, I've spoken with some of the master planners in different cities, and for them the key focus is, how do I increase the number of pedestrians, how do I increase the usage with respect to public transportation, and what sort of new public transportation modes do we need to bring to the table. So these are fundamentally the things which, let's say, master planners are trying to address. The focus of EVs specifically, let's say with respect to cars, it's more about, okay, with the inefficient cars which are present, how do we transition them to more efficient ones? But it's not the solution towards a fully decarbonized kind of environment.
Arvind, thank you so much. And I have big apologies to all of you here, because I can see there are questions at the back that we simply don't have time for. But it's been a wonderful and really interesting session. Murray, Paul, Arvind, Zach, Faisal, thank you for joining us to talk about the future of e-mobility.
At Bharat Forge Limited, we don't believe in pause buttons. 50 years ago, we hit play, and we haven't stopped since. We move, we go places, and we take our legacy with us. We started small, but our dreams were big. And we chased them tirelessly with all our heart. That's what brought us to the top. To the world's biggest names. And to people's lives. We're committed to partnering greatness, no matter where we go. From India to Germany, to France to Sweden and USA. We always go that extra mile and bring the best to wherever our clients are. And we never settle. Over 50 years, we have pioneered innovations across fields. Our expertise keeps sharpening. We seek to build a better, smarter, and brighter tomorrow. And we will.
So we've just been talking about this really important area for decarbonization, and that is the transport sector. We're now going to switch our focus to another really important area, an extremely knotty issue, which is the hard-to-abate sectors like steel, cement, etc. We're going to take a deep dive into steel. We're going to hear from Bharat Forge, we just saw the sponsor video there, and also from Vardhaman Steel, a specialist steel company from India. And then we're going to broaden this discussion to look at the use of steel and cement and all the rest of it into urban infrastructures, because that's, after all, where the steel is going, and how we can create more livable cities, more resilient cities, which are in the thick of at the front line of the climate crisis right now. So a lot to cover in the next discussion. You'll have plenty of chances to put your questions as well. Let me introduce you to our great panelists. From Bharat Forge, we have Vice Chair and Joint MD Amit Kalyani. Amit, please come on up. Do take this first seat over here. From Vardhaman Special Steels, Vice Chair and MD Sachit Jain. Welcome, Sachit. From Delhi, the Director General of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which is an international organization set up by Prime Minister Modi. Amit Proti, here he is. Also from Delhi, founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW, which is one of the leading sustainability think tanks, not just in India, but in the world, Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. Hi, Dr. Arunabha. So I'm going to start off with our sponsor, Amit Kalyani. Now, very few people think about steel as a clean industry. They probably think steel, pretty dirty industry. But that's an outdated concept. Let's find out why. What are you doing then in Bharat Forge? Oh, these should be, can we get a hand mic, please?
Unless you want me to go there.
No, we've got plenty of spare mics.
We've got 4 here, actually.
Here you go.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you can try this.
So, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Nisha mentioned, we're a hardcore manufacturing company. We both produce and consume steel. So we produce steel using 2 routes. One is electric arc and the other is a blast furnace. Our electric arc-based steel company was the first steel company in the world to be certified by a third-party agency to be net zero on steel in scope 2. And we did that by using an approach which was, think local, which is think about your situation, your circumstance, and adapt your business to that. So right from the 1990s, we've been investing in renewable energy. In fact, we were the first manufacturing company in India to set up our own windmills in 1994. And ever since then, we have now invested in almost close to 400 megawatts of wind energy. And about 45 to 50% of our energy as a group is generated by renewable, combination of solar and wind. So when I say that you have to think local and think situationally, is that Scope 2 demanded that both circularity of resources, because you couldn't import scrap or whatever. So we built a network to source the steel scrap locally. And then we converted all our energy sources into either electric or hydrogen-based and eliminated all the CO2 in that process. And today we're already making steel and selling it commercially up to about 8,000 tons a month to people who want to pay the extra costs for being green. And
Tell us a bit more about what you're doing on the recycling front.
Yes.
Because it actually goes beyond simply the steel, right?
So what we had to do was we had to identify sources of raw material for ourselves, which were secondary and which were within a 40-kilometer radius of us. And then we deployed electric trucks, which we convert into electric. So we call them reborn electric. And my previous panelist spoke about repowering, and that's something that we do. We also have certified repowered trucks, and we use them to collect the scrap, bring it to our plant, and convert it into steel. So we've really thought of Scope 1 and Scope 2. And going forward, I think there's tremendous potential to do more in this area. But I think if you look at other industries like cement is probably one of the largest polluters simply because of right from the mining to the manufacturing area. And I believe that with 3D printing, there is scope to even recycle old buildings and extract the cement from that and reuse it in 3D printed structures. You may not be able to build high rises with it, but you can definitely build low rise, low cost architecture using it. So we have to think locally and think situationally. And I want to make one point, Nisha, and the previous panel talked about batteries and all the infrastructure that the government has to support and all the incentives because of the price gap in an EV. And the price gap in an EV is largely on account of the cost of the battery. And I believe that we are all following a wrong model. Everybody is copying what China did and is using the Chinese template for electric vehicles, which is a battery-based electric model. Most countries like India, where we're building infrastructure from scratch, I'm not talking electric vehicle infrastructure, but highways, we still have to build 70% of the highways that we need for the future today. So we can incorporate inductive electric charging in those and dramatically reduce the amount of battery we use to 1/10 or 1/5 of what you would otherwise need, and only use it when you're off the main highways. And that way, dramatically reduce the need for the harmful chemicals and the mining of those chemicals, which is largely in Africa and all controlled by Chinese companies. So
That's a very cool idea and a big idea for you, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to quiz Amit Kalyani on it further, you'll have a chance in the Q&A, right? Is it viable, electrified through the roads? Let's find out a bit more about Vardhman Steel and what it's doing. I think you only have electric arc technology deployed, right?
Yeah.
So are you on the same pathway to squeeze out or squeeze down your carbon
absolutely. Clearly, Bharat Forge Group, what Amit was talking about, are ahead of the curve in terms of being the first company, but we are inspired by them and going ahead in the same journey. So I think there's a lot that companies can do themselves in terms of sustainability. So ultimately, you have to reduce resources. So I'll just give you an example. 10 years ago, we used to import 35% of our scrap from Europe. Today, it's close to zero.
Okay.
So it's all local and all mostly North India. The second, we are talking to car companies that can we use your scrap, what you generate, bring it back, melt it, and get it back to them in a circular economy. Then third is reduce your own resources. Give an example. Our water consumption was 2 kiloliters per ton of steel. We're down to less than 1. Like that, everywhere you cut down.
We know that this will obviously have a positive impact on the carbon emissions.
Yes.
But what is the impact on cost?
These things don't actually, this is eliminating waste from within your system.
Okay.
This is not cost. Okay. I think one thing we keep saying, everything will increase the cost. Not necessarily.
Okay, so some measures can be cost neutral.
For example, going into renewable power, especially solar, actually reduces the cost. So we are in fact putting in a 45% of our power in, by March next year will be coming from solar plants. So this is something that companies can do on their own. So reduce your consumption of everything around and keep it. So we are down to 0.73, not there to zero, but we'll be down to 0.45 carbon footprint, scope 1 and scope 2 by March next year.
Excellent, really interesting. Now I want to look at the cost implications of this transformation. CEW, which Dr. Ghosh runs, has done a big study on exactly this. What are the cost implications of cleaning up the hard to abate sectors, including steel? So can you talk us through what are the implications for India, the big picture, in terms of its journey into the Amrit Kal, which we're apparently right at the beginning of?
Fanfare just before my answer. Thank you, Nisha, for having me on the panel. And of course, very exciting to be on a panel with industry leaders like Bharat Forge and Vardhman Steel. Notwithstanding what has just been said, I think we also have to recognize that as an industry, India has the second largest steel capacity in the world for crude steel manufacturing, about 125 million tons. That goes to, say, 300 million tons over the next, say, 2 decades. So we will be making the material that will make the world, right? And what we have to do is understand then our responsibility in not just being industry leaders, but making sure India retains the market leadership position, but does it in a more sustainable way. When you look at it that way, it actually, yes, there is energy efficiency, circularity. The electric arc furnace route is certainly one route, etc. But when you look at the industry as a whole, at CEW we did the first marginal abatement cost curve. For nerds, it's basically what are the different interventions that you can do and how much reduction do you get for what cost. For getting the entire industry to net zero or near net zero, our estimation is that the CapEx will be close to about $300 billion. And OpEx on an annual basis will be close to about $9 billion. Right? Now, this is not impossible, but it is non-trivial as well. A lot of this reduction to actually bend the curve, like with the pandemic, right? You peak your emissions, and then you got to drag the curve down near to zero. That is the really hard part, right? And our calculations show that despite everything that the industry is doing and planning to do, we'll still need about 56% of the emissions reduction will have to come from carbon capture and utilization and sequestration.
Wow.
Right? That's huge. So you do energy efficiency, you do circularity, you do renewables, you do all the technologies that you can. That's the left side of the marginal abatement cost curve. And then there's this huge chunk of the emissions that have to be abated. That's why it's called a hard-to-abate sector. Now, if you've got to do that, you're going to need a carbon price. And we think that at a carbon price of about $90-odd per ton, the additional expenditure, Amit was just saying, those who are willing to pay that premium, that becomes about 30-40%, but extra. But at a carbon price of about $50 a ton, that additional expenditure becomes about 15%. So it's how then do you not just put all the responsibility on individual steel companies, but how do you look at the sector, and how do you look at the sector not just within India, but the role it plays for building the world. And that's the kind of coordination we need, which will give them the market signal to start investing more and more towards those technologies.
Yeah, and the really expensive technologies are not very proven to some extent, but not affordable at the moment, like CCS. Okay, so before we take a deep gulp and think, how are we going to fund this? Let's just ask the question, what is at stake and why is this so important? And that's what I'd like to put to Amit Proti here. Why is it so important that we do rethink the way we build our cities, the way we build our infrastructure?
Thank you so much for having me, first of
all, I think, just to be part of this eminent panel is a pleasure and the challenge that we face. We've talked about transitioning industries. I represent an organization which is, I'll just give you the name, and if you can help me decipher the name, that'll be my job done. Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. First of all, building a coalition. I lead an organization which is led by India, but now has 39 countries that have joined this leadership. It's about disaster resilience. Resilience itself, if I look around the room, I don't know how many of you can give me a great definition of what is resilience. And then we talk about infrastructure, which is, you're talking about steel, you're talking about roads, you're talking about airports, seaports, etc. So why am I sitting here on a panel with all of you? I think one, as each industry is focusing on achieving its net zero commitments, there are certain other problems that we need to keep in mind. If you're living in Delhi today, it's already 50 degrees. I don't know, did you face it? It was hot like hell. If you're living in Chennai or even parts of Europe, you're seeing floods, you're seeing cyclonic activities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this actually links back to how we are building. So one is that, yes, climate change is bringing new risks to us, but also how we're building is adding to those risks. So for industries, as you're thinking about reducing your emissions, how much attention are you paying today to, is your supply chain actually going to withstand if there's a cyclone coming off the coast of your shipping lanes?
Yeah.
Is your transportation network that you're relying on going to function the way it's designed to function? You have now railroads starting to melt because of heat. The tube apparently is already so hot sometimes that it is unusable. These are just snapshots of examples where infrastructure is, all our lives actually are heavily dependent on infrastructure. And infrastructure that was built in the past is actually facing a lot of challenges already. So when we're thinking about the future infrastructure, what do we need to do? And that'll be the second part of my question I'll come back to. But what do you need to do to start thinking about, let's not continue to make the same problems of today into tomorrow?
That's a really nice point at which to motivate our next round of questions, which is about how do we design better, how do we build better cities and infrastructure in the future. Does anyone want to put a quick question to our panelists at this stage before we move on? Yes, a lady over there. Can we get a mic to her super fast? Quickly tell us who you are, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Carly. I'm from the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. So I was walking around London on Saturday, and I saw a living wall covering a corner of the building. It was 8 stories high. So many different plants, and you could see the insects on it, like fuchsias and ferns, all different things that I wouldn't have expected to have seen in this living wall. Why aren't we doing more of that?
Thank you. Arunam, how can I put that to you? They've just designed their own building, CEW, haven't you, in Delhi?
Yeah, well, we haven't got a living wall. In fact, exactly 2 days ago, my wife was saying, well, we also saw a building, and she said, are there insects in there? And we had exactly the same conversation. I think even before we get there, we've got to think about the general point you're nudging us towards is when are we going to start thinking about the built environment as part of the natural environment rather than the built environment as separate from the natural environment. And we've got, this entire industry that we've built of cement and bricks and mortar as something separate. That's the paradigmatic change that we need in our mindset. Now, you can do it in many different ways. I mean, one example you've given is about cooling down the buildings and regulating the actual ambient temperature that you feel inside the building with the plants that you have outside the building, because then the temperature differential between the inside and the outside is reduced. Then there's cooling of the roofs, what Amit is referring to for heat-stressed countries, but also temperate countries like the UK, where suddenly you have heat spikes. what you need to do is reduce that temperature differential. Then there's the materials that go into it. I mean, some of the examples that we already started talking about, but at our office, for instance, our flooring is either 100% biodegradable or the carpeting is made with nearly 80% recycled products and manufactured in a plant that's running 100% on renewable energy. So then there is, the plants that you've got. Of course, here it rains a lot. In India, we'll have to figure out how do we irrigate those plants. So what we do is retreat, recycle all of our drinking water that is treated back into the irrigation of the 1,000+ plants that we have in our office. Then you have to reduce the lighting load. This is notwithstanding the amazing week we've just had, generally a dark country. So how do you optimize for lighting in a way that reduces the lighting load? We have managed to reduce our lighting load back in Delhi by about 25% just by optimally designing the lighting based on where you're sitting. So I think the bigger point is we are not making these conscious choices in general because we are still leaving sustainability as a choice rather than as an imperative. So if it matters to you, you will do it. If it matters to me as my institution, we'll go the extra mile. I think the imperative comes in the form of the prices we place on water, on energy, on carbon, on materials. The imperative, of course, also comes from consumers. If you're selling,
then it becomes systematic.
Then it has to become
it's
systematic.
Driven from the center.
If it's only voluntary, I don't think we are going to get the scale that you're perhaps suggesting.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ghosh. Amit Kalyani, Bharat Forge is based in Pune, a city which I know very well for my sins, and has been transformed in the last 30 years. Loads of jobs and prosperity, but also it's not a very nice city to live, not that beautiful garden city that it used to be. So I'd like to ask you your personal views then on how do we build more livable, more resilient cities?
So Pune is the balloon that refuses to burst. I was telling Nisha 24 years ago or 25 years ago, it was 2.5 million people, and it's now nudging 9. It's the largest educational center in the world. We have 1.1 million college students in Pune, and they come from all over India, and 80% of them stay back, at least for 5 to 10 years. So you can imagine that every year we have, 1/4 of 1.1 million multiplied by 0.8, increasing to the population just from students. What's the solution? Quite clearly, Pune has lost the opportunity to build infrastructure, even to catch up to where we are. The only thing we can do is now build satellite towns right from scratch so that people don't have to migrate into the cities for jobs.
You think we should be building new cities?
We should be building new cities and building them in places where the jobs are appropriate for those areas, where people have educational infrastructure but no social infrastructure, and make them into new cities rather than overcrowding our cities.
Okay, so there's another idea for you if you want to quiz him on that. I'm just going to first get a response from Amit Proti, because apart from being the leader of the Coalition for Disaster Resilience, he's also an urban expert and has worked in the area for a long time. New cities?
I think thank you for raising that. It always comes up. You see new capitals being built. Jakarta has a new capital now being built because old Jakarta is sinking. There is an ambition to build new, which I completely appreciate. But when you look at examples of where new may have succeeded, where it may not have succeeded, new requires a lot of discipline, set governance systems. So, you need a certain kind of decision-making ability on how do you control what happens on the land. Now, if you don't have that...
So you're politely saying it may not be that much better than the old.
I think it's harder to imagine new solving the problem of the old if the inherent problem of the old is also related to not having enough capacity, not having enough data. When we plan, we make decisions based on certain understanding. If we don't have that capacity in India, that we've got how many settlements? Arunabha can probably tell me the number of settlements in India. Now, if we want to go and plan new ones, we actually need to also pay attention to the old ones and improve the quality of the old ones, while I'm not discounting new, because there's a lot of old industrial towns that exist in India that were new. You have examples in Seoul, for example. If you think about the satellite city concept, there are about 6 around Seoul city metropolitan area. Not all of them are functioning very well. And Seoul actually arguably, they can control who goes where, more than maybe in India. But they're not able to yet have successful satellite towns at this point.
Amit, this lady over there wants to ask a question.
I want to make one point. Just because something doesn't work somewhere doesn't mean we don't try. Okay? I think we need to try and keep trying. We may fail first time, second time. But as long as we see the percentage of success in the overall project improve, I think we can sharpen our pencils and get better. And my only point to what you both said, and said very eloquently, is master plan should be made upfront, and anybody can develop only within that master plan. And obviously the master plan has to be managed and controlled and set to be updated like a constitution is. Otherwise,
I'm going to take the speaker right away from you.
Sorry, my intention was not to pause this conversation that was going on. I'm Pooja Maru. I'm a partner at Anandrati Investment Banking. My question is actually going back to one of the earlier comments on carbon capture. And I just want to ask the panel the feasibility, I think we've talked about hydrogen feasibility. I just wanted to understand where technology and feasibility is for carbon capture.
Arnav Ghosh.
This is, carbon capture has been happening for decades in certain industries, but not happening at the scale that is needed for the global economy as a whole, obviously, which is why I gave the range of prices, right? At a certain, close to $100 a ton, you get a certain kind of technologies going. At $50 a ton, you get something else going. It's not just about capture, it's about sequestration. In India, we've done another study at CW which looked at India's unique geological kind of position, that we have got massive basalt rock formations, which makes it suitable for a form of sequestration, which is not the same as the kind of sequestration you would do elsewhere. So again, I think Amit used this phrase, localize or think locally. And I think when we even use this phrase carbon capture, the way you would do it in the UK might not necessarily be the way you would do it in India.
Right.
But what is needed is definitely clear price signals on carbon, but also international coordination on the massive amounts of R&D that will need to go into not just carbon capture, but also carbon dioxide removal.
Something occurred to me earlier while you were talking, Sachit Jain. I just wanted to follow up with you, and that is the need to develop a scrap market, right? And at the same time, we are trying to promote EVs, right? We're trying to get people to trade in their old cars. Is there a way in which cities and the steel industry can work together?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, India has a problem that in the future, already there is a scrap shortage. So India is still importing scrap. I mean, I may talk about my company is not importing, but India as a country is importing scrap. And we still have these old vehicles which are belching out thick smoke. And there is a scrappage policy. I think the point is we need to have a scrappage policy being implemented. But the problem is we don't have the infrastructure just now that if the government decides to scrap it and implement it, where will they get scrapped? So this is an investment opportunity because the world, UK particularly, also has companies that do this. This is an investment opportunity to come in and invest in India. And once the infrastructure comes in place, then very strict enforcement of this. So this can easily be done because the rules are in place. There is enough old vehicles lying. You just need another 2 years or 2 to 3 years in which to build up this scrappage infrastructure around the country and then enforce it.
But there's another interesting idea for you, ladies and gentlemen, and an investment opportunity too, should you want to look into it further. Just get in touch with Sachit Jain. We are out of time, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry, my dear friend in the front row who's been waiting to ask a question. Let's put our hands together to say a big thank you to Amit Kalyani, Sachit Jain, Amit Proti, and Dr. Ghosh. Thank you.
Switch. This is very well done.
Thank you. Not the easiest.
Hi.
Jagjit. Okay, so we're about to move on now to an amazing subject, which I, for one, can't wait to hear about, and that's about bots. Can bots help us reach net zero? And I'm going to hand over to Jagjit Sareen, Jagjit Sareen, partner and global climate lead at Dahlberg Advisors. Jagjit.
Thanks, Nisha. In climate change, we say we are up against time. With this smell of the yummy food, I think we are up against some other race in time as well. And we got 15 minutes to help solve the climate crisis with the help of AI. And with that, let me invite a stellar group of panelists, Dr. Gauri Singh, who is the Deputy Director General of IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, Mr. Uday Khemka, and Ms. Ashima Arora, partner at Local Globe, pardon me. Uday is the Vice Chairman of the Sun Group. He may not remember, but I've been following his work since 2008 when he led the P8, the Pension Funds 8 group, bringing institutional investors money to climate change. It's been a long journey, and you've led an incredible group of now, I think, P80 or P180, I don't know what the number is, but trillions of dollars looking to invest in climate. With that, let's focus on AI. When we step back, we see in the last decade, if not more, two aggressive trends happening. One is digitalization at all levels, and second is electrification at all levels. You know, the mantra is electrify all sectors of economy and green the electricity. Whatever is left, hydrogen and biofuel and a few other things will take care. And then we see the intersections of electrification and the digitalization. And of course, there are some basic things which are happening. And AI as a solution has been just coming up on radar over and over again. I was just flipping through a report which IRENA produced in 2019, an innovation primer, talking about the potential of AI for both the supply side, demand side, grid management, what have you, role of AI in green transition. So my first question would be to Dr. Singh, from your vantage point leading a multilateral institution, but also in your experience as a very senior bureaucrat in Government of India, as you led the green transition journey, where do you see AI helping us? Where are countries in their journey, and what is the regulatory side push we need to bring AI at its fullest potential? Over to you.
Thanks, Jagjit. It's great to be here, although I think the 15-minute challenge is quite daunting. But I'll try and maybe take us all through some of the big trends. You're right, digitalization and electrification are two major trends that we are seeing. And I could, in fact, add decentralization as a major trend, because decentralization is what we see with large number of generators on rooftops and wind turbines all scattered. All these are actually shifting the whole focus of how the power sector used to traditionally operate. And digitalization will be a key amplifier, because when we're looking at a very complex and a data-driven power sector, it's what will convert this data into value. So it's extremely important. And I just want to take us through maybe one quick example of what we might see as we get into a more electrified world. And this electrification is happening both on the supply side but also on the demand side, because there are mega loads which
till now were being, being powered or are still being powered by gas and fossil fuel will start getting converted into demanding electricity. So there will be buildings that will require heating and cooling. There will be heat pumps. There will be EVs, charging stations of EVs, and many other which will come into the whole spectrum of what power sector needs to deliver, and will be both consumers and generators. So, and to add to it, you have a power system that's becoming more and more driven by variable renewable energy, which means that the intermittency has to be managed as well. So when you put all these together, you're actually looking at a very complex set of, relationship between the consumers and the producers, which the power sector has to get adjusted to and also be able to respond. And I think that's where AI comes in to play a big role. So if you're looking at also Internet of Things, which is, currently you have about 25 billion devices that are interacting, producing data. By next year, it's expected that these will be 75 billion. So you're looking at this huge expansion of data that will come in. And that, again, means that with AI and big data and also blockchains, which will all come in as enablers, while they will not, no single thing is a silver bullet, but look at it more like a toolbox with these elements that can all reinforce each other as we try and manage a very complex power system going ahead.
Thank you for giving us the macro, but also micro issues related to it. Let me come to you, Ashma. So, at Dahlberg, we put social impact as the mantra, and with each data center being built, the cooling requirements could take care of the water demand of 100,000 people in the city. Everybody wants to go to Chennai and build a data center for AI capabilities and all that. And we know what happened to the water availability in Chennai. One day you switch on, no water. You invest a lot on climate tech solutions. So give us your vantage point on solutions, not just AI, but the whole set of things, set of challenges we need to solve for when we put lives and livelihoods at the center of energy transition.
That's, I think, a wonderful question. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I think majority of my life has been spent in climate tech, blockchain, and the better part of the last 2 years has been spent in AI. So having kind of seen the potential burden that a large number of technologies cause on climate and the larger energy crisis that we're all dealing with, there's a very important aspect whenever we invest at early stage, be it at a new AI company, and there's always this conversation, which is, why do you need 10 million to be spent on compute? And then there's another second layer, higher order conversation that we have about the climate burden of having that level of compute, as to why can't we sort of innovate to a point where we don't require that much compute. So just to kind of flag a few companies that I feel are kind of heading in that direction. One is this entire theme, which you also touched upon as well, which is decentralized as well as distributed compute, as well as storage. So historically, compute is not new. TCP, IP, and World Wide Web has been around for more than 30 years at this point. But compute and storage historically has always been centralized, which is why, majority of the investors in the audience would know that AWS is the reason why Amazon stock performs well, not the Amazon.com e-commerce website. AWS does nothing but give you that kind of cloud compute that is needed for running what we know as the internet. We are all, majority of the audience is basically looking to be Indian, not to be racist, but all of us use WhatsApp and Meta and Slack and larger, majority of even Google, majority of the sort of current big tech players use AWS in some way, shape, or form. And that historically has been centralized compute. This newer theme of decentralized compute, companies like Qubit, companies like Jensen, which are doing decentralized compute, Hyperbolic AI, which is based out of the Bay Area, they are guaranteeing 100x, minimum 100x reduction in the sort of energy requirements, and by default, increasing the energy efficiency of the different kind of hardware and software that we use today. I personally believe that there's this study that I read, which is by 2030, 3.5% of all energy in the world would be used for running different types of compute and running different components of AI and AI agents, which is, in my opinion, like the next step after bots in the next 5 years. That to be kind of, to give some context, Germany takes about, I think, 3.7% energy annually globally. This is literally one of the top 10 economies of the world where AI is going to actually play that big of a role. And then, of course, be sort of, touching and interacting with definitely more number of people. But at the same time, we need to ask ourselves, what is the layer or level of innovation that is still missing to enable this number to go significantly further down? And how can we, as investors, as innovators, as advisors, as consultants, play a role in this kind of a massive shift?
Thank you very much. Now let me bring big money into the conversation, and that's where you come in, Uday. Tell us how big money institutional investors are looking at AI and all digitalization as a growth agenda to push forward with the green transition. Too many jargons in one sentence, but you're not new to big things.
Well, it's great to be here today. Given how little time we have and how wonderful those two interventions were, I feel like shutting up and listening, quite frankly. But nevertheless, Uday Khemka, I'm Managing Trustee of the Khemka Foundation. I know when we met earlier, you were pushing me on the finance agenda. I have a different agenda I want to bring to this. Very simply, on the finance agenda right now, there's massive greed in the room. That is to say, most of the finance going into this is coming from the corporate sector, from these very high valuation companies, or from sovereign governments like the UAE government and other governments. And they are just trying to create massive victories in foundation models and in the latest LLMs, taking huge amounts of compute and not caring very much about their energy signatures, which is why I loved your comment. That having been said, it's still early for, obviously the venture capital groups that are funded by the big institutions are already in this space, you know that. The valuations are crazy high. I think that's less interesting in some ways than binding together the two conversations we've already had. Because with Ms. Singh's brilliant top-down analysis, you see the demand side of what we need to deal with. And imagine a world, a matrix world, in which the old utility of the past, which had, produce 500 megawatts and send it to thousands of people, that era is ending. The utility is going to be a traffic cop, dealing with all these different decentralized generation points and utilization points. And, oh my God, it's a nightmare. Can you imagine a world in which that could conceivably exist 5 years from now, 7 years from now, without data and AI being right at the center of it? The problem is we don't have the data on the corner cases right now yet. So generative AI will be adopted very slowly by conservative utilities until all of that's thought through. Traditional AI will be used. On the low voltage side, but in the demand side, the low voltage side, people can play around with it in the home utilization, solar plus storage, and the charging. That's where it'll start on the generative. But of course, we can have a longer discussion about data. On the other side, thank God you had your intervention, because the energy, I heard 8%, not 3.5%, is this massive surge in the need for energy, just when we were damn well trying to stop the climate impact of all this energy. You've suddenly got the dark side of what's happening. And I loved your comments, because that gives me hope and some other elements we could talk about. A very simple taxonomy. We've created an organization within the foundations that's got nothing to do with finance. It's called GRAIL. It's a bit of a Western word, GRAIL, like the Holy Grail. Green AI Learning. It's a collaboration between universities all over the world and domain themes. So I visited Ms. Singh's organization recently in Abu Dhabi, Irina, to say, hey, you've got this network of 36 utilities. How can we work with all these AI startups to start to think about the challenges of the next 10 years? How do we create that collaborative framework? Similarly, we've created something called the Collective for Clean Transport, which is doing the same thing for EV, because it's one energy system that's going to emerge by the end of the decade. all the EV storage and usage, all the built environment storage and usage, all the grid. It's all one system that's data enabled. So, so those are what we might call downstream solution sets. Most of the AI scientists right now are pulled in two different directions. Either they're making tons of money doing ridiculous nonsense on retail, or they are doing upstream stuff on atmospheric science, which is very important, and monitoring methane and satellite data. Why? Because they can get the data. The data is the critical problem. So Grail is about downstream solution for power, for EV, and so forth, right? One other thing I'd like to add, it's not only about electrification. AI can impact climate change mitigation also in other areas, like material science.
Yes.
I was just at the University of Manchester on Friday. I spent the whole day looking at this amazing stuff. If you take an analogy from life sciences, how AI will help create new materials that decarbonize. I'm going to be quiet. That was my intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David, with this amazing energy and set of solutions which you bring to this discussion. I think we are at time, so I'll take a pause unless people tell me we have a few more minutes for questions. Do we? Okay. So time for 2 questions, max. There.
Thank you. Yeah, just inspired by what you were saying about the traffic cop analogy, with this huge network being, hopefully managed by AI, and obviously data centers is the other classic one. I just wondered, is there any kind of relation to carbon markets in the sense that they sound like something that's very information heavy, and the only thing I can think of is satellites checking if a forest is cut down or not. But are there roles for AI that are being investigated, or anything interesting that you can share?
Yeah, happy to kind of flag a couple of things. I think in general, as we kind of see the further level of innovation that's happening at a fundamental technological, be it foundational models, be it at the middleware infrastructure level, we are seeing more and more of different kind of carbon markets emerge. So just to give you an example, there's this one company called Reflect Orbital based out of Los Angeles that is now creating this very thin filament mirrors attached to the solar panels on a satellite that go up in the atmosphere. Now, they are creating this kind of angular capture of sunlight in such a way that the efficiency of the solar panel attached to the satellite is significantly higher. So to throw some numbers at you, currently, like an average satellite, the way it's kind of constructed, about 5 to 7% of the solar panel is able to kind of live up to its full potential, given the kind of, there's like night and day, et cetera, and the location of the satellite in the atmosphere. With this company and with the kind of mirror that they're attaching, which is actually just like a thin filament mirror, it's not really a mirror, they are able to increase this number to 82%. Now, this will create different kinds of carbon capture and like energy efficiency markets that will not just be for corporates, but it'll also kind of have a very big bearing on the financial markets. Another company that I can think of that can potentially impact the space is this company's new patent that came out recently, I think less than 4 days ago, actually. It's called Final Spark. I'm hoping I'm remembering the name of the company correctly. They are based out of Switzerland. They have created like a supercomputer. It's literally a biocomputer where they have synthesized lab-grown brains. And 16 of them have been put together to create a supercomputer. Now, this level of supercomputing is, again, extremely useful for the kind of compute and foundational model that will be run. And again, reducing the kind of burden that it'll actually have on the energy crisis that we have, and by default, create different kinds of carbon capture markets.
Wow, I was just counting the number of supercomputers in your intervention at the last row. Go ahead. You want to say something?
Well, just briefly, MRV, obviously, there's huge amounts on data capture and analysis, and that's spreading very rapidly, and you should assume that, and that's critical for the quality of carbon credits. So just take that as intrinsic. It's happening, it's spreading it fast. Is it just Pavan Sukhdev's company? I forget, someone here might know. Anyway, there are companies now working hard on data and AI to improve the quality and accountability and reporting of carbon credits into the market. Now, we normally think of that in terms of avoided emissions, but I would say all of what I've said also applies to the more expensive, higher quality carbon dioxide removal, CDR type application sets for carbon markets as well. So watch this space. I think huge amounts is happening.
Well said, Uday. Watch this space. And we haven't yet started on the resilience and adaptation AI. That's another huge opportunity for addressing the climate crisis. With that, let's give it a round of applause for the stellar panelists. And to you all for being a lovely audience. Thank you very much.
I will certainly want to put some follow-up questions myself. We've got a wonderful lot of programs for you all through the week. I'm just going to mention a couple of them tomorrow: IGF Studio and IGF Dialogues. Plus, we have our summer reception outdoors in the terrace in the lovely hotel around the corner, the Taj St. James's. So please join us then. Right now, though, lunch is being served downstairs in the Marble Hall. See you soon.
Moment in my annual calendar.
So the importance of IGF, it's actually about the quality of conversations.
I think it's such a fascinating mixture of people, businesses, the public sector.
We need places like the India Global Forum for the rest of the world to be interacting with.
We are all united in our desire for the same things. We want our businesses to grow, our careers to flourish, and our communities to thrive. We want to meet people who energize us, share exciting ideas, and discover new opportunities.
From India to the UK to the UAE and beyond, IGF is committed to bringing the contemporary India story.
Under the leadership of Manoj Ladwal, the forum is doing a great job bringing together global climate leaders.
That we see the Indian community for the success story you are in 21st century Britain.
फ्यूचर बहुत ब्राइट है, हम बहुत तेजी से और एक बड़े स्केल के साथ आगे बढ़ते जा रहे हैं.
Amongst ongoing global turbulence, IGF remains at the center of limitless innovation, limitless possibilities, and limitless collaboration, harnessing talent, technology, and enterprise across sectors and geographies for maximum impact. India Global Forum is the gateway for global stakeholders to invest in and benefit from India's global trajectory. Hear from industry titans, build strategic partnerships, invest in the future. Only at India Global Forum. Join the conversation at www.indiaglobalforum.com.